Great. Welcome to the June 6th Dev Call, everyone. So today's agenda, we have a few different items. We have decentralized channels, which Dan is going to give an in-progress update on the changes that happened last week and things that are scheduled for next week. We have a new FIP. Vripan and David Furlong have been driving this, which is the Longcast FIP, which we talked about in the last Dev Call. And so we'll spend some time discussing that, talking about the trade-offs, collecting feedback from folks, and talking about next steps. And we have some updates from the Hubble side of things. There's a couple of more low-level changes around link defragmentation, shuttle, that Sanjay wants to talk through. So those are the three main topics from the protocol side. And then from the Warpcast side, we have two other topics. One, an update on things we've been doing with the feed. And two, some very high-level thoughts on how we're thinking about frames and sort of the next generation of frames. And this is more of an open discussion rather than a specific proposal, but wanted to surface these thoughts early to folks. Okay, with all that said, let me go over to topic number one, turn it over to Dan to do the update on decentralized channels.
Yeah, so we've been making progress. Shout out to Chris, who's also been driving the actual engineering work. The big changes that we rolled out last night that I think kind of are getting us closer and closer to being in a state where I think that we're ready to work on taking the product experience and turning it into a technical specification for decentralization is around the control of the main feed in terms of the algorithm. So we started with a trending type algorithm, which is very simple. Take the number of likes, divide by time, and put a gravity factor. It's basically the Hacker News algorithm. Naturally, there are a bunch of channels where people don't like that, which is understandable. The reality is if you're actually not actively moderating a channel, that trending algo is actually quite useful. So offering people some ability to change that algorithm on a test basis now, so the ability to go from that trending algorithm to strict reverse chronological, kind of want to see how that plays out over the next week or so, just to see what percentage of people are interested in that. And then similarly on the control of the recent feed, not to be confused with the reverse chron main feed algo. I think the goal of the recent feed when we added this is if you don't have a recent feed, you're going to get a massive number of accounts that are complaining about being shadow banned, right? It's not clear to people that when you post, if it doesn't show up in the main feed, why doesn't it show up in the main feed? There's a bunch of work that we can go do there in terms of education, but the fundamental thing that people get frustrated with is they're trained on other social media that they should be able to post wherever they want. Especially on a kind of a network that feels like Twitter. And when it doesn't show up, that creates a lot of frustration. Obviously, for the channel hosts, the flip side, they don't want people who are posting off-topic, spam, etc., in their channel. And so we thought that this idea of giving a main feed, which again, I'll repeat forever, most people consume content in home feeds, then a small subsegment click through, they look at the main feed, and an even smaller subsegment would actually ever tap the recent feed. That said, the host tends to be pretty keyed in terms of every bit of content in their channel. So hosts don't want the recent feed. So we've added the ability to toggle that off. Want to see what percentage of channels turn it off. We'll send out a note to folks in terms of a programmatic DC just to kind of make sure people are aware of those settings. And then kind of be able to make an informed opinion in terms of should we even have the recent feed if we move into the protocol or include it as some type of setting. There was some feedback in one of the chats, I think both Jason and Nonlinear. Just to be super clear, these are very easy to decentralize in terms of some type of setting that is public so that a channel can tell clients how they want to have cast be ordered and whether or not to have a recent feed on. But I think I just kind of want to see how things play out in terms of giving people control. The last remaining item that we've gotten consistent feedback from channel hosts is just setting up moderation is a little tricky. I think having gone through it myself, I know Automod is making some improvements and same with Airstack. I actually think once you kind of get over the hump, it's actually pretty straightforward. And so I think the last change that we're thinking about on the Warpcast side is just to actually make it much simpler from a kind of understanding of, okay, here's what's happening when you're using moderation, no moderation, moderation using kind of the very basic version with Warpcast. We don't want to be in a moderation business and all the complexity that comes with that. And then actually a much clearer call to action around, hey, looking for more flexibility or kind of more control over your channel, consider using one of these tools, click, and then actually having some type of experience where people can actually learn about them and then go off to something like Airstack or Automod. Okay, so that's where we are. I'm curious if there were any feedback for people. Okay, less than 40 people dead. Hosts have notice on their channels, at least they should. I'm not sure I understand that, nerd. So feel free to either reply in chat or come on. Yeah, Jason, I know you're launching some things, same thing with John at Automod. So I'm actually optimistic that within the next, call it week or less, we're going to be in a position where Warpcast will do a better job with a CTA around adding moderation and using a kind of more flexible, powerful tool. And then that you guys actually will have like a great UX from an onboarding standpoint. So I'm not too worried there. Nerd, did you want to say something or? Terms of decentralization, that's going to be a little bit of time. And just from a testnet standpoint, I actually would defer to the team on how we approach this. I don't know if we'll quite go to testnet first. It might actually make more sense to just we test to make sure it works and then it goes live. And then, you know, rather than have developers actually try to build on a testnet and then actually switch it over. Varun, what would your gut say?
Yeah, I think we want to lock down a couple of these like design elements around channels first, and then figure out how we would launch the contracts. I think there's a reasonable version where if the contracts are simple, we get them audited and we launch straight on mainnet, and we don't do the testnet to mainnet process we did last time. But it really depends on like how complex we think things are. So we'll have a better picture of that probably in like 2 to 4 weeks.
Yeah, so the thing that I would say is, one, we have these public APIs. We will probably add the additional changes that we made, just so that, you know, kind of it's reflected so that people can actually start building against like, this is what the primitive is going to be. I wouldn't like jump the gun here unless you're building channel moderation software, because I think we should wait until we kind of have like a technical design. And then we can kind of say, hey, this is what is actually going to get built. And then so you can kind of build towards that environment. And then maybe there's a version where you're using kind of either Warpcast or Airstack or Nanar, someone who's like reflecting that channel data. Obviously, all the casts are already on the protocol. And then kind of like once it's live in the protocol, it should be a relatively easy changeover. And if you're using something like Airstack or Nanar, in theory, they actually could just have the same API and they're just pulling the data from a different source. So I think that would be how I would approach this. I don't actually think like people should be like overly focused on, you know, kind of what the technical implementation of the protocol is in a world where most people are going to be using infrastructure providers.
Any other questions for Dan before we go on to the next topic?
Yeah, Jason, we'll get you a better CTA that's like something similar to what you actually put in the chat in terms of the mockup. Like we're thinking along the same lines of like being able to push people over. I think that there's a balance where we're also trying to figure out is like, okay, you have no moderation, you set up moderation on Warpcast. Like one simple thing is like, if you set it up and you put yourself, maybe people you follow, like that's automatically there. So it's just like, you don't have to literally like every cast, but then it's like looking for more flexibility. Here's like a very clear CTA. It's like token gating, all the stuff that people actually want in terms of control. And I think that upgrade path keeps the UX really simple to start while actually getting people to a place where I think any sufficiently interesting and large channel will be using channel moderation software. I think regarding Automod, so Automod is one of many tools or multiple tools, and I think Airstack actually is pretty intuitive in terms of like setting it up. I know they have some big improvements, so let's kind of see how they go. I know John is working on a new onboarding flow, right? Like he had an existing product that was very focused on negative moderation, right? Removing things from channels. So this whole like inversion thing, and it's like, it's not clear versus I think a simpler like, hey, like get started with moderation. I think that there's something equivalent to that happening. And I would imagine Airstack and Automod and other tools will continue to iterate to like have the best user experience. So there will be a little bit of turbulence during this interim. Cool. Yes, I think John has gotten that feedback loud and clear, but I would encourage you to try out Airstack as well. Cool. Let's move over to talking about longcasts, which is the second item for discussion today.
So before I hand it over to Bripan and David to provide a little more context on how they're thinking about the proposal, just want to share a couple of high-level thoughts. So one, it's actually been really amazing to see how many people have pitched in, provided feedback, and how this is iterated over the last 2 weeks. I was actually out for most of last week, and so I sort of announced it at the last dev call, came back on Monday, and there was this like amazingly well-written and well thought through FIP. So it's been very, very awesome to see that progress. Second, I think before we get into the discussion of the specifics of how to do this and feedback, I want to level set on like the high level goal for why are we trying to introduce this? The main reason to add long casts or to add longer form content is to bring more interesting new stuff into Farcaster that makes it more useful for all users. So if we were to think about one metric by which we measure which solution is the right solution, it should be the thing that encourages more users to create more content that is interesting to other users. And whatever drives the largest amount of that, that's probably what we should lean towards in terms of the right solution. And I think broadly speaking, there are two similar but related features of how users share long form content that's worth just like separating out before we get into the technical details. The first one is people sharing articles that they've written on other platforms on Farcaster and being able to expand it natively within clients. So this is the version of I have a blog, maybe it's on Paragraph, maybe it's my own blog, maybe it's a Substack. But when I share it on Farcaster, rather than having it kick out to another app, which is always high friction, there's actually a really nice experience where when you expand it, you can just read it inline in your feed, and you can actually like browse this and have a really good experience. I think the FIP as it stands today actually has a pretty good proposal for that, where you can just embed JSON into like HTML objects and just get this really nice experience. The second form is people actually creating the long form content in the app. So this exists on Twitter today, where you can actually make like, 1,000 character or 2,000 character tweet, and it's simply just an extension. So visually, there's no difference. In the previous version, there's like your cast, and then there's an attachment. In this version, it's simply just a very, very long piece of text, which is truncated, and you see the first one, and then you can read the rest. And the difference here is you're expected to compose this inside the application. So this is like a very different modality of you don't write your post somewhere and share it and make it easier. You actually are creating the longer form content here because you saw some topic that you want to respond to, and 280, 320 characters just isn't sufficient to respond to it. So they're related, but I think they're slightly different, like in terms of UI, client treatment, et cetera, et cetera. And so I want to separate these two out as like two possible use cases before we dive into the technical details. But with that, let me turn it over to Bripan, maybe to just give a quick summary of where we are today and any open questions that you want to ask the group and collect feedback on today.
Sure. I wasn't ready for this, but so the FIP evolved a lot since it was first submitted, based on the feedback from a big number of people. Where we are now, I think we answer both of these use cases. So the JSON can be embedded in an HTML page, in which case the client will have to search the HTML and identify the JSON much in the same way that they do with Open Graph tags, and extract the long cast. The second mode is linking directly to a JSON file which is stored somewhere, either on a web server or on IPFS or Arweave. And regarding your second concern, it wasn't something that I had in mind, that we have to make it relatively simple for clients to implement the creation process. But the current proposal only supports text, which I think it's the simplest form of creating content. If there's a text box, anyone can implement it. And so, yeah, this is the high level. I don't know. For me,
can I weigh in there?
Yeah.
So I think clients, if they want to support users writing a long cast in their client, could either kick it out to a third-party storage for the JSON, or they could, host it themselves if they want in their own database. So I think there are ways to do it. in the interface. So you can either write it in the client or pull in an external sort of blog post in a natural way with the suggested implementation.
Cool. Let me kind of add a couple of thoughts on how we're thinking about it from the Workcast side. And then also want to open it up to like questions or comments from everybody else. So the one thing that I think this is in a really good place from a technical perspective. There's a couple of tweaks we can make on, parameter names, et cetera, but those are like minor details. The major component is we have this model where you have a pointer and that points to some very simple text that you can extract either from an HTML page or a direct JSON object, and you can enrich your app with it, which makes sense. The thing that we should do from the client POV and actually prototype from a design and composer UI is like, for example, how do you compose a long cast from within Workcast? And one of the challenges that you'll run into is like, right now the composer is sort of this rich surface where if you type @ it will actually automatically tag somebody and do all of this stuff. But when you get into the long cast, which is just plain text, that actually doesn't work quite as well. And so there's currently a difference in terms of like how the cast part of it feels versus the long cast part of it feels. And so that probably has to be reflected in the editor so that the user understands how they're traversing the surface. Or maybe we figure out some like smart way to actually make both the surfaces feel the same so you can actually have both these components over here. It's not yet clear to me what the right answer is, but I think once we build like a very simple prototype and test out the UX, we'll get a very good sense for, does this feel correct or does this need a little bit more tweaking? So to take a step back, I think our POV is we need to build some client prototypes and mocks to get a sense for, does this feel right, before we turn around and implement it. And that's something that we're going to start thinking about now and like try to get a sense of like when we can do this over the next couple of weeks. But let me see if anyone, yeah. So Greg has a point of, shouldn't Longcast also support mentions? I think that's a good question, right? There's like mentions, channels, all this other stuff. Should they have rich context? And I think the nice thing about Brightpan's and DF's proposal now is it's very simple and it's just text, which means it's super easy to scrape and pull and display. But I think it does mean that there's a difference between the long cast surface and the cast surface, which has like slightly richer content. And so want to see how that feels before we make a decision on, should we make these feel the same, or is it actually okay to have this difference because simpler is better?
Also, when it comes to mentions, because they were part of the original proposal, it's partly up to the client. I mean, if the composer wants to actually implement mentions, they could. There's nothing stopping them from actually adding the mentions in the cast object. And also, when you read the cast, if the client is smart enough, it could change that mentions to links and make them clickable. But we also have to consider mentions also trigger notifications, trigger other things that may not be easy to implement in this context.
Yep, I think that's exactly right. Cool. Are there any other high-level questions or thoughts people have on the proposal, especially if anyone was participating in the discussion and has like strong feelings about the technical direction one way or another?
One more thing I would like to mention is that the way that we have designed this, it's extensible. So it is a way to implement long casts, but might also be a way to implement other data types or richer content. So mentions that were mentioned before could be part of the JSON in some future version. And it would be relatively easy also to implement other things like locations, events, things that could provide more rich content in the Farcaster ecosystem.
Yep. Cool. So what we'll do over the next 2 weeks from our side is at least come up with a list of all these open questions and prototypes that we need to do to figure out what the right interaction surface is. And hopefully by the next dev call, we'll have some update on at least a stronger POV on, should this just be plain text to start? Does it have to have mentions on V1? Are there any other problems we're not thinking about today that we will have to start thinking about when we implement this? Cool. Let's see. Yeah, Tony has a good question. I mentioned this slightly earlier, but it's just like, how do we visually present both the text in the cast and the long cast? Like, do they show up side by side? Is it like an embed? And I think we'll try to do some design mocks and come up. But if folks in the group have ideas, want to do simple Excalidraws or Figmas and share them, that's also always welcome. Sweet. Maybe we'll wait for feedback for like 5 more seconds to see if anyone has any questions they want to propose. Going once. Going twice. Okay, cool. Let's go over to topic number 3, which is Hubble. So thanks DF and Vraipan for getting Longcaster to the point where they are today. It's really awesome to see. But now Sanjay will pick up on Hubble and talk through link defragmentation and shuttle updates.
Quick updates. We're gonna start shipping link defragmentation. I'll post the link to the FIP if let me see. Basically, it's a way to do, it's a more efficient way to do link compaction right now. Like as most of you know right now, like both the add and the remove of a link takes up space, and so we have to frequently do compaction to which means publishing new link add messages with like a later timestamp to push out the removes and save storage space on the user's account. So link compaction is a way to do that more efficiently by just publishing one message instead of like thousands of messages, potentially thousands of messages. As a consumer, you don't have to worry too much about it. Like especially if you have like if you're using shuttle to consume these, like the hub is going to generate the delete event for the links that are being removed, and like you don't have to do any special handling of the compaction message itself. It's just like more of a notification to hub to be like, oh, pin these link ads and everything else don't matter. But anyway, so that's going to roll out probably sometime this week. And also reminder, we're going to deprecate replicator and remove the code. Most people have been using shuttle, it's been working fine. And if you're still using replicator, please switch over to shuttle. I'm happy to help like with the migration if you need any issues. We've also added like reverse reconciliation to shuttle, like that a bunch of people have asked for. This is for catching cases where the message is in your DB, but it's not in hub. So typically when you missed like a delete or like a prune event, this will help you catch those issues and fix the data on your side. I'm also debugging like an issue with the Aztec team where like potentially shuttle might be emitting events in the wrong order. If you see this happening, let me know. It'd be helpful to try to figure out how what's triggering this. But yeah, that's basically it.
Cool. And the takeaway for this is both link defragmentation and shuttle updates only matter if you are listening to a hub and streaming data into Postgres. Link defragmentation should actually be, and Sanjay, correct me if I'm wrong, should be a no-op for most people. Like it should just sort of magically work if you're streaming events. And this is more of a low-level change for clients on how to present, how to defragment links. And then the shuttle updates, if you're using the old replicator, we strongly recommend moving to the new shuttle. That's going to be the managed version. We're also going to remove the code from replicator from the latest version of the repo. So just to make sure people are not starting to use an old and unsupported version. And Sanjay just dropped the link in the chat if anyone's interested in digging into the details of how the link defragmentation works. Any questions on this before we move on? Cool. Okay, so next thing I want to talk about is just updates on the Workcast side, just so people are aware of like larger changes to how the apps work. So the first one is feed improvements. Over the last month, we've been testing out an ML-based feed. And so the basic thinking has been, can we actually come up with a feed that learns your preferences and is able to surface the most interesting and relevant content to you at the top of your feed? So for the most part, this is not injecting net new content into your feed. It is simply taking what's all the stuff that you haven't read since the last time you were on the app, and how can we show you the most interesting stuff on the first page so that you're seeing stuff from people that are relevant to you, people that you actually want to follow and see posts from. And we ran one experiment which actually had pretty promising results. And so for the first time, we switched over 100% of users to the new ML feed, and we've largely seen positive feedback from a bunch of folks. If you're seeing any weird behavior, bugs, very uninteresting content, or stuff that you don't like, please let us know. And what would be very helpful is actually a screenshot showing like your feed and what you're seeing. That helps us debug cases where there are bugs or other issues where we might not be making good recommendations. But for the most part, you should think of the improvement as the content hasn't changed. The stuff that is showing up in your feed is the same, but the order in which they are shown is optimized to surface the most interesting stuff to you first. So if you wake up and have 30 seconds to scroll through your feed, you're seeing the things that you might care the most about. The second change that we're working on, this is actually currently running as an experiment, so half the people will have it and half the people won't, is showing replies in your feed. So for those of you who've been using Warpcast for a very long time, you might remember the days of reply bumping, where every cast would always show a reply if it existed, and it would sort of reorder in the feed. We're bringing back replies in a much more subtle way. So right now, the only change is if a cast shows up in your feed at whatever point, and if there is a reply from either a person that you follow or someone that the author has engaged with, so author is clearly signaling this is an interesting reply, then we will show you that reply if the reply also has some engagement. So it actually brings in some of these conversations. And the reason this is powerful is two things. One is it encourages more conversations. Now, when you reply to somebody, your cast actually will get more distribution. And so you don't have to just rely on quote casts to get your voice heard. You'll actually get more people just seeing your replies when you say something interesting. And two, it also exposes new people in the feed. So I may see the feed, I may see, Horsefacts replying to something. And now if I wasn't following Horsefacts, I now have the opportunity to follow him. So this both helps discoverability of users, and it also helps with discoverability of content and conversations happening. The reason we're running this as an experiment is we are curious to get both qualitative and quantitative feedback. We want to see how people feel about it, but also how the numbers move in terms of, are people liking more stuff? Are people following more people? Are people discovering more things? And then make a call sometime next week on whether we think this is a positive change or a negative change before we roll it out. Let me pause there and see if anyone has any questions. There's one. Does the reply only show if the person who posted engaged with a... So I believe, and Chris can correct me if I'm wrong here, there are a few different criteria that would qualify a reply to be able to show up in your feed. The first one is if you follow the person who made the reply. So that automatically means you might be interested in the person. The second is if the author interacted with them. So even if you don't follow one of the repliers, but the author has actually liked or replied to something, that ticks it up in terms of interest and brings it to the feed. And I believe the third signal is also a power badge and whether or not the user has it. After all of these things are done and we find the content, we will then find the most interesting one. So let's say there's multiple things that the author has interacted with, et cetera, et cetera. We will pick the one that has the most engagement so far and surface that to you. And there's also a minimum engagement cutoff. So if something has like 1 like, it probably won't show up. And I think right now the bar is at least 2 likes, but we might tweak that over time to make sure that you're getting only interesting replies in your feed. Cool. We're also planning to do a bunch more tests. So just to give you a sense of what's like coming down the pipe. One of the tests we want to run is injecting more channel content. So if you follow a channel right now, we will largely only show you stuff if people you follow post in that channel. But one of the experiments we'll run is to say, okay, what's the most interesting trending new content in a channel that you follow? And can we show that in your home feed to make it more interesting? So this actually gives posting in a channel more distribution, particularly if a user has interacted with the channel a lot. The other thing that we're trying to do is add more signals into the recommendation engine. So one of the things we want to teach it is the difference between, not all follows are equal. There are some people you follow whose content you're really, really interested in, and some people you followed but maybe don't care about their content as much anymore. So training our ML model on which users and which channels do you care about the most, and surfacing that first in the feed and pushing the others down to later in the feed. So both of those things are like experiments that we'll try to run over the next few weeks. We'll run all our experiments the same way. They'll roll out to half the people get the old version. We measure the impact. We also look at qualitative feedback from people and then make a decision on whether to roll it out or not. Cool. So if you have any feedback, see any bugs, see any issues, please let us know. Chris and Akshan have been doing a lot of great work to get this over the finish line, and there'll be a lot more experiments coming soon. Okay. Last one is sort of more open-ended exploration of frames. So there have been kind of a couple of challenges we run into with frames as we've started expanding them and moving them into direct casts. The main challenge is the surface area for a frame is actually fairly high. And what I mean by that is, like, when we tried to go and implement frames in direct casts, we weren't able to take sort of the naive frame and just like plop it in there, because if someone shares a couple of frames on like a mobile device or other places, it actually just takes up a lot of surface area and doesn't quite fit. So this is kind of an increasing problem of, we want to have entry points to frames that are maybe like more compact and more reasonable, so that they can actually surface in areas that are not as big or as wide as the feed itself. The second problem with frames is they actually take up a lot of visual space in the feed. And when a frame is uninteresting, it actually like significantly increases the chance that someone like stops using the app or goes away, because the frame is almost like, you know, on a mobile device, like half the screen. So again, there's sort of this like large surface area for frames that's happening. So one of the ideas we're playing around with to try and solve for this is a more compact entry point for frames. So rather than having this like very large button and a bunch of very large image and a bunch of smaller buttons and a text field, we're experimenting with the notion of trying to collapse frames into a smaller surface area that acts more as like a simple call to action. And when you click on it, it actually expands into a larger frame, which is kind of more traditionally the large image and the 4-button things. This has two benefits. One is it's denser, so you can see more interesting stuff in the feed. You can get a lot more stuff. Two, it actually sets us up to say, once you expand a frame and it opens up, we can do a lot more interesting things with that frame. So rather than have it be constrained to an image and 4 buttons, you can actually imagine a version of the world where that's actually an iframe, or something like super interactive, where it's like more like an application, which is an idea we've been talking about for a while, but haven't actually been able to implement, because one of the challenges with having the large frame surface load first is we have to do a lot of caching and a lot of like pre-rendering, and that makes that very, very difficult. So to sort of recap our thinking around this, we want to start with the design experiment of seeing, what do compact frames look like? And there's some of that already happening in DCs. We're going to try and play with a few more design experiments in feeds, which will be largely backward compatible. So they don't break existing frames, but they'll give people a chance to try out this new UI and see how it looks and feels, and we'll collect quantitative feedback and qualitative feedback. And if that feels good, we're very excited about moving forward with a compact entry point, because that sets us up to be able to do like much more interesting things with frames down the line, such as like actually make them more interactive, more programmable, and not be as constrained to the 1 image 4 buttons model that we have today. Horsefax, anything that you want to add on that?
Not a ton more. I would say we'll probably propose some new metadata tags that can help us with this this smaller, thinner format. Like, one thing that I think will be useful there are titles. So I would say, if you don't have a Open Graph title or just a page title on the page where you're serving your frames already, it would be good to go add that now, because we're probably going to read that. We'll probably have, kind of as we've done with frames before, we will have some new frame-specific metadata tags you can use for fine-grained control over these if you want, as well as some default fallbacks to Open Graph data. But one that comes up as I've sort of started looking at this a bit is page titles, right? Many of them say, you know, frog frame or something similar. So I think almost all frameworks have a way to just add that tag to your page and set up a title. And so if frame devs get ahead of that, that will make things easier for everyone.
Yep. There's a few questions in chat, which I'll try to answer. First one on frames: when does this new change take effect? So V1 of this is already out, because we found it hard to launch like full-size frames in direct casts. The version that shipped actually has a more compact representation for frames. So if you want to get a sense of what V1 looks like, if you share a frame in a direct cast, you'll see it already. V2 probably says, how do we actually bring this to feeds? And we'll run an experiment where, again, for some group of people, we'll show like more compact frames and collect feedback on like what that looks and feels like. And we'll try to do it in as backwards compatible a way as possible, so frame devs don't have to do too much other than just make sure there's like some title metadata there for this to look and feel nice. For example, one version of how we might do it is to say, if you share multiple frames, maybe the first one is expanded and the second one is collapsed, or if you share an image in a frame, one is collapsed, one is expanded, or try to do some smarts around there. We haven't yet finalized exactly the shape of what that is, but we'll try it out and see. And expect some iterations there where we try different versions, see what clicks for people. also measure how it affects conversion rates, because if a frame has a smaller image, like maybe fewer people click on it. And so we want to track all of that data and make sure we're not hurting the accessibility or usability of frames with some of these changes. And so by the time we meet next, we should probably have some early experiments that have already run and collected feedback. And then if that feels good, we'll have sort of a more formal, like, hey, here's how we like update and propose this as a formal change to the frame spec. Cool. Few more questions. There was one on curious if the ML model could determine if frames are more relevant, safe, and only showing them. So two things here. There's safety and there's interest. So for safety, we actually have Blowfish and Blockade that actually run when transactions happen and will kind of tell you like if a transaction is unsafe. And there's actually a combination of automated and human monitoring that does that. The second thing that we are going to run as an experiment with the ML model is learn if people like to use frames, because there are a set of people who just don't want to use frames or don't find them particularly interesting. And so one of the things that we will try to train the ML model on is like, do you like to interact with and use with frames? If not, we will show you fewer frames. And if yes, we will show you more frames. So that's, again, another ML experiment that we'll probably run in the future. There's a question on, is there a disadvantage? Sorry, this is going back to the ML model. Is there a disadvantage to posting more than 40x per day? Will posts get less visibility? Not explicitly. I don't think there's like a clear, like if you post a lot, stuff gets like deranked. I do think that one of the things we will start doing over time is like, how many posts from a user did you view and how many of those did you interact with? So for example, if you send 100 posts and Horsefax saw all of them and clicked on none of them, the probability of you showing up at the top of Horsefax's feed will go down. But if you wrote 2 posts and Horsefax clicked on both of them, very likely that if you post again, it will go to the top of Horsefax feed. So a little more subtle and like personal based, but less of a rule of like, if you post a lot, your stuff doesn't go down. But like the way to think about it is, if you're posting stuff that is interesting and that people are engaging with, you should keep posting lots and lots of stuff. But if you are posting things that get absolutely no likes whatsoever, no reactions, no replies from other people, it will probably fall lower and lower in the feeds of the people that follow you over time because they're not interested in engaging with it. Cool. Let me kind of walk through the questions. There's a bunch of chat here. Are FC frame preview star tags supported? Horsefax said that those are not live yet. Would be great if frame devs can get a couple weeks notice on the new framework for expanded frames. Yes, we're not going to make any like backwards incompatible changes without giving people a lot of heads up and rolling this out. Most of the changes we have on the compact entry point, we think we can make in a totally backwards compatible way. It will just be like an extra click before you get into the true frame that you see today, and we'll see how that feels before we do that. Frame starting time in the feed. Curious if some of this might be due to quality of frames and not necessarily the UX of using the frame in the feed. I think that's absolutely right. I think it's a little bit of both. It's like a decent chunk of like, if you see an uninteresting frame or multiple uninteresting frames, you're likely to like stop scrolling. And so like give increasing content density and showing you more interesting frames is probably the correct answer. Is there a way to see what the ML model thinks of your preferences? So I'll actually share some stats. Akshan actually has a really nice dashboard, so I'll try to make a little cast about this and talk about like how the different factors go into influencing how the model thinks about it. Just keep in mind this changes over time. We retrain the model every few weeks or every week, even in some cases. So what it predicts today may be different from what it predicts tomorrow. But I'll try to share a high-level snapshot of how it's thinking about things today. And a way to see how the algorithm ranks your current posts. So this is highly personal, right? It actually doesn't rank your posts. It ranks your feed, which is a very different thing, which is it says, hey, I'm going to take all the new content that you haven't yet seen and then sort it by what's interesting. So it's kind of a very different filter. It's not like your post gets an absolute score. It's for this person that is generating their feed that follows you, where do you sit in the list of all the other interestingness of, what someone generates today? Instantly thinking about how having some sort of a folder of dense frames pinned on a channel page. Yeah, I think that's like there's a version where like frames in more compact senses is like, almost like a pinned form for a direct cast group or channel is like a very interesting UI. That's something that's been kicked around and we want to explore as well. Cool. It would consider an accessibility feature for frames that provides a text-based version of each frame. Oh, that's an interesting idea. Lots of duplication. Yep, I think that's also a very good point where, like, if you see the same frame multiple times, maybe the follow-on versions are actually collapsed and you only get a single large version of the frame. Do frames change the way ML treats curiosity on a cast, i.e. a cast per frame is interacted a lot? So right now, the ML model doesn't actually train on your interactions with a frame. So it doesn't optimize for or try to make that better. That's something we might change in the future. Also, the model is not an LLM. Yes, the model is not an LLM. It is a decision tree for those who are interested in how it actually works. Or decision forest, I guess, technically. Will Warpcast eventually go full TikTok style algo feed? I don't think it, I think the answer is no. It's not going to be a feed where we just like randomly show you the most interesting stuff from the network and like there's no follow graph. I think that's a very radical version that maybe works for videos, but less likely to work for where we are today. The way we think about like ML in the feed today is for people who are very active and have a lot of followers, when you log onto the app, you often have hundreds or thousands of unread casts, and you almost never read through all of them. And so the purpose of the ML feed is figure out, you know, if on average you read 10 to 20 casts every time you open the app, out of the like unread chunk, figure out the most interesting 10 to 20 casts and bring them at the top. So whatever time you spent on the app is spent on the most interesting content. Over time, we will likely inject more content as well. So one of the things we don't do that we want to do is if you follow a channel and someone you don't follow posts in that channel, we don't often surface that to you today. And we want to start doing that now that we have better ML and recommendation models, because you clearly said, I care about this channel and we should start feeding you more content from this channel. So I expect like smaller changes in that dimension that we start doing. Cool. Would the upcoming ML model have public APIs to track rank? So to be super clear, there are no rank. Like this is, I'll share a longer cast on like how the ML model actually works. But I think it is not a simple, this person is number one, everything that they post goes into the feed. This person is number 5, everything goes. It is highly personalized. And so your ranking, so to speak, really depends on the person that's following you and who else they're following and how interesting they find your stuff relative to the other stuff that they're following on the network. And so there's no global rank that we can sort of give you and say like you're number 2 or number 3. It is very, very personalized and discrete, but I'll try to do a longer thread that provides more color on how it actually works. Dan mentioned he wanted to do a live streaming on Warpcast in the stream a few days ago. I actually don't know what that is. Dan, you want to take that one? Maybe Dan doesn't know.
I didn't say that.
Okay, Dan denies all association with that, so you'll have to.
Yeah, I don't need to do any more live streaming. It's okay.
Cool. Okay, I'll see if there's any last questions that I can take. Inverse rendering. Okay, cool. I think that's all we got for today. We're at 10:45, so this is perfectly on time, and we will wrap here. If you did ask a question that did not get answered, you can just tag me on Farcaster, and I will try to do my best to respond. All right, see you all in 2 weeks.
Thanks.